The war between the US military and the Taliban has lasted 20 years, making it the longest war in American history. Despite the efforts of the world's strongest military, the Taliban maintained a dogged resistance, launching hit-and-run attacks across the many deserts and mountains that cover the country. Much of the Taliban's tactics and strategy come from its experience fighting the Soviet Union in the 1980s. During that time, the CIA covertly supplied and trained many Afghans in the art of guerrilla warfare. Today, the US is dealing with the repercussions, as the cost of the war has been immense, with US taxpayers contributing over $2 trillion and 22,000 killed and wounded US soldiers. On April the 13th, US President Joe Biden announced that all troops would withdraw from the country by September the 11th. Starting in May, the Taliban began a multi-month-long campaign to secure the rural areas of the country. The Taliban concentrated their forces in the north, where they had historically faced the most resistance from local tribes. The south, in contrast being ethnically Pashtun, presented far less of a challenge due to their cultural affinities. After consolidating the countryside, the Taliban turned their focus to the urban areas, having cut them off from the major overland supply routes. And by August, many cities were contested or under siege by the militants. As they advanced, Afghan soldiers, underpaid and without the support of the US, began to desert in the thousands, leaving the city's garrisons dangerously depleted. After many weeks of steady advances, the straw that broke the camel's back occurred on August the 6th, when the small border town of Zaranj fell to Taliban forces with little to no resistance. As in many other villages and towns across the country, the Taliban negotiated and bribed local leaders to switch sides. This created a cascading effect that caused city after city to surrender peacefully. Over the course of the next 8 days, nearly all of Afghanistan's major cities fell to the Taliban, with government forces and militias either evacuating or surrendering without a fight. The sheer momentum of the Taliban victories had created an atmosphere of the writing was on the wall, which completely broke the will to resist for the majority of the Afghan National Army. On August the 15th, Kabul found itself surrounded as Taliban fighters began to enter the city from multiple directions. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani fled to Tajikistan, and US embassy staff were reportedly destroying classified material before evacuating via Black Hawk helicopters. A crisis began to unfold at the Hamid Karzai International Airport, as tens of thousands of foreigners and Afghan civilians attempted to board flights leaving the country. In response, the US and UK deployed 3,000 and 600 troops respectively to create a safe zone for the aircraft and evacuees. In Doha, the capital city of Qatar, Taliban diplomats agreed that there would be no interference with the evacuation as long as the Americans respected the August 31st withdrawal deadline. The need to reach safety caused pandemonium outside of the airport gates, where vast crowds attempted to force their way in, waiting to be evacuated. The utter chaos led to the following scenes. On August the 26th, An ISK suicide bomber attacked the Abbey Gate, detonating his vest close to a group of American soldiers. Directly after the explosion, several gunmen reportedly opened fire into the crowd, with American soldiers returning said fire, killing the attackers quickly. It was reported that friendly fire was responsible for at least some of the civilian casualties due to the panicked response and close quarters nature of the skirmish. At least 169 civilians lost their lives that day, with another 132 wounded. American casualties amounted to 13 dead and 18 wounded, marking it as the worst attack on US soldiers in Afghanistan since the 2011 Boeing Chinook shootdown. To add to the mountain of tragedy, US forces responded by conducting a drone strike against a suspected ISK vehicle in Kabul. It was soon uncovered, however, that the strike hadn't killed any militants. Aid worker Zamari Ahmadi, as well as 10 of his family members, including all 7 of his children, were mistakenly killed instead. While the Pentagon suspected Ahmadi of associating with ISK, the veracity of that suspicion is irrelevant. What is to be highlighted here is the deathly recklessness of US decision-making, something that many critics have been underlining as the root to the majority of the chaos associated with the withdrawal. Despite the latter events, the airlift continued, and by August the 31st, the last plane left the runway. By all accounts, the evacuation effort was a miracle, with over 122,000 people airlifted out of Afghanistan in only 16 days. That's roughly 7,600 people every day and about 5 people every minute. Following the withdrawal of NATO forces and the rapid collapse of the Afghan National Army, the Taliban found themselves in control of several abandoned US military bases and the full arsenal of the formerly 300,000 strong Afghan military. This left them with about 75,000 military vehicles of varying types, 200 planes and helicopters, and 600,000 guns of varying caliber. With this new equipment, the Taliban has become a powerful military force in Central Asia, leading its northern neighbors on the global firepower rankings. Only in the Panjshir Valley did the Taliban face any serious resistance. Opposition fighters and remnants of the Afghan military rallied behind Vice President Amrullah Saleh, who proclaimed himself the new commander-in-chief and vowed to carry on the fight. In early September, Taliban forces launched repeated attacks against the valley's defenses before finally breaking through and securing the area. Unconfirmed reports seem to show that casualties were heavy on both sides. In the end, Saleh managed to flee to safety in Tajikistan, while the remaining resistance fighters withdrew into the mountains. The fall of the Panjshir Valley was the last nail in the coffin. It was the final bastion of resistance to succumb to the Taliban conquest, and thereby solidifying their control over the entire country. That was it. The Taliban had won. With peace finally possible in Afghanistan, trade and foreign investment in the country's infrastructure will become a priority for the new players in Kabul. While the country has long been known for the illicit yet highly profitable cultivation of poppies, there is a far more respectable export that lies beneath its ancient mountains. In the 1960s and 70s, Soviet geoscientists surveyed the country and discovered that it had some of the largest reserves of rare earth metals in the world, the sum of which could be valued at around $3 trillion, a fact that is not lost on the Taliban. The extraction and exportation of these resources could raise millions of Afghans out of poverty and give the country a significant place in the global economy, similar to that of the Gulf states, which had rapidly grown rich through their natural resources in the late 20th century. The Soviets had attempted to set up mining projects following their invasion in 1979, but had been forced to abandon these efforts after their withdrawal a decade later. The Americans would attempt a similar venture when in 2017, former Presidents Donald Trump and Ashraf Ghani agreed to give US companies access to possible rare earth mining sites around the country. Trump even said that his strategic reason for staying in Afghanistan lay in American companies profiting from the country's mineral resources. No conspiracy there. Alas, the proposed investments never materialized, as strong Taliban resistance made any effective extraction efforts untenable. From a grand strategy point of view, Afghanistan's valuable mineral reserves would have given the US a supply route independent from China, which is its main supplier. Geographically, the country provided a string of military bases that lay just west of China, south of Russia, and east of Iran. Such a position was extremely valuable as a part of US foreign policy of containing its longtime adversaries. With the withdrawal of US forces, Afghanistan's neighbors are already vying for access to its markets. As the premier superpower in Asia, China seems to be a primary beneficiary, as the expulsion of the US provides a more secure path to its One Belt, One Road initiative. To highlight its interest in Afghanistan, a high-level meeting occurred on July the 28th, when a 9-member Taliban delegation met with their Chinese counterparts in Tianjin, a city in northeast China. Chinese diplomats warmly welcomed the Taliban and extracted promises of non-aggression in Xinjiang, China's majority Muslim province in the far west. In return, China will likely invest heavily in the country's mining industry, provided that the Taliban are able to maintain the uneasy peace that seems to be taking root across the country. In the early 20th century, Saudi Arabia became immensely wealthy owing to the export of its vast petroleum deposits. Throughout the course of its history, the Saudi royal family ruled through a strict fundamentalist interpretation of Sunni Islam, called Wahhabism, or in Arabic, Al-Wahhabiyya. Only recently, under the country's new crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, has the country started to moderate its views on human rights, including women's rights. The trend seems to be accelerating, and the Wahhabis seem to be losing their control over the future of the country's religious ideology. In Afghanistan, the possibility of peace and prosperity is at hand, regardless of who holds the reins of power. The country has suffered decades of violent conflict, but with the Taliban in the ascendant position, it seems unlikely that widespread fighting will continue. Assuming that the Taliban can establish their equilibrium, then there is no doubt that the country will be governed by the laws of fundamentalist religious thinkers for years, and perhaps decades to come. But I would not disregard the moderating force that foreign investment and economic development may have on Afghanistan's rulers in the medium to long-term future. If Afghanistan is to technologically and economically modernize under an established Taliban status quo, we could see a rise in the demand for relative liberalization. Should the Taliban wish to maintain stability in such a case, it may have to relax its strict fundamentalist attitudes, similar to what is occurring in Saudi Arabia. The situation, while settling, is still volatile. Perhaps the Taliban will dominate for the foreseeable future, or perhaps there might be something else written in the sand for the war-torn nation. If you enjoyed this content, please consider liking and sharing this video. If you'd like to stay up to date with our latest posts, you can subscribe and click on the bell button and set it to all so as to receive notifications whenever something new is going on. All of this helps us immensely as we are working hard to provide you with better, more frequent content. But if you'd like to take one step further in supporting this channel, feel free to check out our Patreon. While it is empty at the moment, as we grow you can expect exclusive posts, polls and other Patreon benefits to make their way to the page. Thank you once again for tuning in today, and I hope to see you on our next episode.